A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Shabbos at the Gitzah.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be cut loose.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and this episode is dedicated in honor of the upcoming trip of Jewish History Soundbites to the United States this coming week. I want to remind you about this trip. I'm going to be arriving in New York on July 26th. We'll be there for a week, and there are still a couple of lecture spots available if your shul or organization or whatever is interested in having me come and talk. It's the 9 days. It's a opportune time to explore our past a little bit. And of course, the main event is a very special Kivrei Tzadikim cemetery tour at the Mount Judah Cemetery in Queens, and lots of Kivrei Tzadikim, lots of Jewish history, really nowhere like it in America. It's almost like Har Menuchos here in Yerushalayim. And that will take place Friday morning, July 29th at 9:30 a.m. It's Rosh Chodesh Av, so it's an appropriate date. And you can register for that cemetery tour on my website, yehudageberer.com. There are still a few spots still open. So we're looking forward to seeing you, meeting some of the listeners in person, and going on a tour together at the Mount Judah Cemetery. So register for that at yehudageberer.com. What I'm going to have now is, even though I'm continuing with the Jews Saving Jews Holocaust series, of course, but I want to interdisperse it with regular episodes, since it can be a bit overwhelming to have too many Holocaust episodes in a row. So I'm going to have a 2-part series about the life and times of Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, a very, very special personality and historic personality, and there's so much to say about him, so I don't believe that we're going to be able to do it in one part, so I'm going to have to do it in 2 parts, one now and one next week. Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer was overshadowed much by his contemporaries of his day, other great rosh yeshiva of his day, contemporaries of his, friends of his from the Volozhin Yeshiva, such as Reb Baruch Ber Leibovich, Reb Shimon Shkop, others, his brother-in-law, Moshe Mordechai Epstein, to a certain extent, the Slabodka, the Meitchte Ilui, many others who were with him in Volozhin, who was somewhat overshadowed by them. He outlived them all, so he gave the impression of being a post-war Torah leader when all these others were pre-war Torah leaders, but he was a contemporary of all of them. He really belonged to the world of pre-war. He was a drop younger than them, but he came to Volozhin very young because he was quite a brilliant young individual. He also seems to have been overshadowed by his illustrious son-in-law, Rav Aaron Kotler, who Rav Aaron Kotler was a personality, a very charismatic, very outgoing, very energetic, very dynamic, louder to a certain extent, and also a great builder. So he and already in Slutzk, and then for sure in Kletzk, Rabbi Aaron Kotler had already taken over when his father-in-law, Rav Isser Zalman, moved to Palestine in 1925. So there, he's already pre-war. He's somewhat overshadowed by his young, dynamic son-in-law. In addition, what also put him out of the limelight is that in 1925 he moves to the land of Israel, and the center of Jewish life at the time was still Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Lithuania, and he's out in Yerushalayim, hanging out with Yerushalmis, and on even a more superficial level, he adopts the Yerushalayim dress to a certain extent, which was the custom at the time, and he puts on a strimal. And so the pictures from his later in life make him look like some sort of Yerushalmi or even a chassid, as opposed to the Litvische Rav and Rosh Yeshiva at the center of Lithuanian Torah life that he was for the majority of his career. And therefore, there's all these misconceptions about him, and I feel like it's time we pay him his due by putting his place in history right here on Jewish History Soundbites. So I'll start off by saying I remember when I was a young Talmud of Mir Yeshiva, and I was by the Shir of Rabbi Shiravieli. And if I recall correctly, we were studying at the time Bava Kama. Could be I made a mistake with the Masechta, I don't remember. And there was a guy walking around the Beis Medrash in Beis Shalom, where Rabbi Shir was. And he's walking around, and he obviously was looking for something to do. So every couple of guys who looked like they were excited about seeing him, he would stop and start hacking them. And his hack was Rav Isser Zalman's Chakira in Bava Kama. And apparently this guy didn't have anything else to talk about in Bava Kama, so he drove everyone crazy about Rav Isser Zalman's Chakira. But the point I'm making is that Rav Isser Zalman has, in several places like this classic yeshivish raid, this classic yeshivish questions and answers from his Even Ha'ezel, his magnum opus, his very important sefer that he has on the Rambam, and in many very very famous yeshivish raid is attributed to him. So he has that place in the yeshiva world, and people are familiar with his Torah. Another story, also from the Mir, is that, and this story brings out how he's so known yet not well known and not understood in the historical context of his time and his generation. This time I was already married. I was in the Ner Gavriel Beis Medrash, which was a halacha Beis Medrash. I was in a halacha chabura, and the Rosh chabura there was a halacha rabbi. And the distinction between the lumdus style of learning, which is in the regular classic yeshiva masechtas, as far as to make a distinction between that and the halacha style of learning, which is focused on the halacha lamaisa. So two different styles, and different chaburas in the Mir adhered to those different styles. So I remember citing a psak of Reb Tzvi Pesach Frank, the Rav Yerushalayim, and he was citing a psak that he had heard from Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer regarding some sort of halacha about Havdalah. So I quoted this, and someone there said, I don't know if it was the Reish Chabura or someone else, what is this? I never heard Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer being cited for a psak. It's so strange. And they commented how strange it was to hear this. So there are two historic things that this fellow was not aware of. Number one, at the most basic level, Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, the Rav Yerushalayim, was Rav Isser Zalman's first cousin, his younger first cousin, and they were very close, and they lived in close proximity to each other, and they discussed halachic issues all the time, so it would make perfect sense that he would cite him. So that's the first thing he wasn't aware of. The secondly, and more importantly, Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer was the communal rabbi of Slutzk, which was quite a prestigious town, not some small little shtetl. Slutzk was an important, significantly sized city, And he was there for quite a few years. He was the rabbi for decades. Over 20 years, he was the community rabbi there. And it's an old city, and he was in charge of the Bezdin, in charge of all the psak, and he paskined all the shilas. So he was a very, very prestigious and important pasik. So why wouldn't he have a psak? And again, people are not aware. In many ways, Rav Isser Zalman was the last of his generation. By the time he passed away in 1953, he was likely the last world-renowned Torah leader who was an alumnus of the original Volozhin Yeshiva. There were other Volozhin alumni who were still alive, but they were not, very famous. There were others who studied in Volozhin following its reopening, but I'm talking about the original Volozhin before its closing in 1892. He was, in a way, the last of the Mohicans. He was the last of a generation. He had been there quite young, and he lived, well into his 80s, and he was a relic of a different generation, and he made that bridge to the post-war world, which almost no one else did from his generation. So he's an important link, a bridge, important link in the chain of Jewish history and Jewish tradition to carry that over from Volozhin to the post-war world and the rebuilding in the land of Israel after the war. He had a very interesting life, his youth, and he studied in Volozhin, his marriage into the prestigious Frank family of Alaksut, a suburb of Kovno, and then he was a rosh yeshiva in Slabodka, and then the rosh yeshiva in Slutzk, and then the rabbi in Slutzk, and then World War I, and the Bolshevik Revolution, and being the rabbi of Slutzk under communism, and then eventually he retires to the land of Israel, and he becomes, in retirement, the rosh yeshiva of Eitz Chaim in Yerushalayim, and then his later years, he comes even further out of retirement, and he's the head of the Moyetzes Gedolei HaTorah of Agudas Yisrael in the state of Israel, and he's during the stormy early years of the state and the formation of the religious attitude towards the state and in the political realm. And Rav Isser Zalman, in his last years, when he's already quite elderly and trying to live out his golden years, he's actually in his most active phase of leadership. So he had a very, very interesting life that crossed time periods and continents. I remember hearing about him from one of his closest students from his later years in Eitz Chaim in Yerushalayim, Reb Nata Freind, an old Yerushalmi tzaddik who lived across the street from the Mir. And when I was a student there, I used to eat shalashudish by him, and he used to tell us stories. And one of his favorite topics was relating stories about his Rebbe, Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, and he was literally a ben bias by him. He used to study with him, and he would actually assist him in writing the Even HaEzel. Rabbi Isser Zalman's work was the Even HaEzel. Now, Rabbi Isser Zalman had everything formulated in his mind, what he wanted to write, the exact wording that he wanted to write in the Even HaEzel. The issue is that he had a sloppy penmanship, a handwriting, and at least the printer in Yerushalayim thought he did. I don't know if objectively he did, but the printer was not able to read his handwriting. So the Rabbi Isser Zalman would dictate the Even HaEzel to his wife, Rebbetzin Bela Hinda, who we'll get to, and she actually wrote the Even HaEzel. Problem was, Rebbetzin Bela Hinda sometimes was shopping or cooking for Shabbos and was unavailable to be there to transcribe the wording that Rabbi Zalman would speak out the exact wording that he wanted and to be written. So he would commandeer this Reb Nata Freind to write the Even HaEzel. So he used to joke with us that he was a partial author of the Even HaEzel. In fact, Reb Nata Freind showed us a piece of Even HaEzel that Reb Isser Zalman cited him, my dear student Reb Nata Freind. So there's actually a shtickle Torah in there from Reb Nata Freind himself. So he was really, really close with him. In fact, he was considered one of the best students in Eitz Chaim. So when Rabbi Isser Zalman, at the beginning of the war, he was able to send a certificate, a visa certificate from the British Mandate to his grandson, who was stuck in Lithuania, in Kovno, Reb Shner Cutler, Reb Aaron Cutler's son, who was a young student at the time, in Kamenetz, I believe. So Rabbi Zalman was able to get him a visa to get out and join him in Yerushalayim. So Reb Shner is stuck in Yerushalayim for 6 or 7 years with his grandfather. So who is he going to learn with? Reb Shner Cutler is is a tremendous Talmid Chacham and a young promising Torah scholar. And the Eitz Chaim level, yeshiva level, was not at the par that Rabbi Shneur Kotler was used to in Kamenetz. So who's going to study with him? So Rav Isser Zalman had Reb Nutta Freund study with his grandson, Reb Shneur Kotler. So he was Reb Shneur's chavrusa for 6 or 7 years. It's an interesting story, actually, Reb Nutta Freund, I'm just remembering now, from Reb Nutta Freund. One of the favorite stories that he used to tell us about Rav Isser Zalman's later years is that Rav Isser Zalman lived in Nachlaot, in Batei Rand, somewhere in that area, Batei Broida, Batei Rand, somewhere over there, at the end of Nachlaot, near Shari Chesed, near Rehov Betzalel today. And this was Rav Isser Zalman's first real exposure to, on a social level, to Hasidic neighbors. In Slutzk, he didn't really have it much. In Volozhin, he definitely didn't. So in Slabodka, also not. So here in Yerushalayim, Hasidim and non-Hasidim lived side by side in peace. So he had this exposure. So one time he was locked out of his home because his wife, Rebbetzin Beila Hinda, was shopping at the nearby Machane Yehuda. So he was elderly, so he asked one of his neighbors if he can sit down and rest while he waited for his wife to come home. So of course they welcomed him in, they sat him down, and he asked for a sefer. Now the families in Yerushalayim were quite poor in those days, and Sfarim were quite expensive. Most people only used the Sfarim in the shuls, so they didn't really have any Sfarim in the homes. So the only sefer that this Hasidic neighbor of Rav Isser Zalman had was a Kedushas Levi of Rabbi Yitzchak of Barditchev. So she handed it to him. The hostess of the house hands it to him. So he studies the Kedushas Levi. He was around Hanukkah time, so he studied some Torah of Hanukkah, and he didn't say a word. And when his wife came home, he said thank you. He returns the sefer. He says thank you, and he goes back home. A year later, around Hanukkah time, he knocks on the door of his neighbor, and he says, "Can ich haben jene sefer? Can I have that sefer? The Kedushas Levi, that sefer, the Litvak." He asks for that sefer, Kedushas Levi. So, I always say, if even Rav Isser Zalman loved the Kedushas Levi, then we can all utilize that sefer also, the sefer Kedushas Levi as well, of the Barditchever. In any event, so let's get back to the beginning of his life. He's born in Mir. So here we have a real mirror that may have even studied for a short time in the local Mir Yeshiva before he went to Volozhin. It's unclear. I think he may have. But when he arrives at Volozhin at the age of 14, he's known as Zhunya Mir. His name was Isser Zalman, and somehow the nickname became Zhunya. I guess it's a Yiddish Russian derivative of Isser Zalman. And since people were very often known by the name of the town of origin, so he was Zhunya Mir, and he was this young student. He became a favorite very quickly of both the Nitziv, Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the longtime Rosh Yeshiva of Volozhin, and of Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik, who was eventually Reb Chaim Brisker, who is now the assistant Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin. He was the grandson by marriage to the Nitziv, and he becomes the young rising superstar in Volozhin during its last years of the yeshiva, when there's a lot of other famous people there. It's a golden age of the yeshiva. It's the last golden age. He was there for 7 years, from the age of approximately 14, shortly after his bar mitzvah, until he was approximately 21, from the years 1884 till 1891, till really a year before the closing of the yeshiva. It was a great time for the yeshiva. The Reb Chaim Brisker's shiurim were very popular, and he became a close student of his, and other Reb Baruch Ber Leibovich was there. The Meitzah Te'ilu was there. Rav Kook was there. Rav Zelig Ruvain Bengis was the future Rav in Yerushalayim of the Eidei Charedis, was there and was one of the closest friends of Rav Isser Zalman. I think they either roomed together in the stanza, or they even studied together in the Beis Medrash. I don't recall which, but they became very close. And many relationships that he forged in Volozhin would serve him well later on in his life and career. And many of these people, great leaders in many different areas, would all cross paths, and it's very interesting how they each developed. Rav Kook ends up in Yerushalayim, Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer ends up in Yerushalayim, and Rav Zelig Ruvain Bengis ends up in Yerushalayim, and their neighbors in Yerushalayim, they're not actually, Rav Zelig Ruvain and Rav Kook did not overlap. They were there at different times, but Rav Isser Zalman overlapped with both, and they're each part of a different ideological community, and yet they're close friends from Volozhin, and they continue to be so. So it's a very interesting situation. It was one of the stories that Rav Isser Zalman used to relate in his later years about his time in Volozhin was unrelated to the yeshiva altogether. It was when there was a fire in the town, and fires are very common in the town because they had coal ovens and to cook, to heat. Everything was these wood or coal ovens and wooden homes, and fires burnt down the towns all the time. It was a common challenge of living in anywhere in the world, actually, at the time. So he described one of the fires in Volozhin during his time as a student there, when all the yeshiva students went out to assist with rescuing people from the fire and getting them to safety and bringing water and forming brigades from the wells or from the the streams, whatever it was, to try to put out the flames and prevent it from spreading. And Rav Isser Zalman, in the middle of all this mayhem, notices that there was this skinny, weak, one of these day laborers, like a tailor or something, who was known as this, elderly, bent over, skinny, no muscles, not strong at all, not one of the people who you expected to have supernatural strength. And he notices him jumping into a burning home, and because people were screaming inside, and coming out carrying under each one person under each arm, carrying people out from the flames, carrying two people and carrying down the block. And he was amazed by the strength that this person had to be able to carry him out. And he's stopped in his tracks. He couldn't believe what he saw. How does this person find the strength to do it? And Rav Isser Zalman's conclusion was, "When se brennt men, kriegt men koiches." When it's burning, we discover inner strength that we had, adrenaline, and we're able to do things that we never believed we'd be able to do. Because when se brennt men, kriegt men koiches, we realize that it's burning, and we need to save people. We need to get them out of the flames. We need to save their lives and get them out. And for him, he said that became a lesson for life, and that drove him the rest of his life. That when se brennt men, kriegt men koiches, when we may think that we don't have the strength, we can't build, we don't have the energy, we don't have the abilities, we don't have the talents. But if we understand that se brennt men, we understand that it's burning, then all of a sudden kriegt men koiches, that we know we have the strength to do it. All we have to do is understand that there's a fire burning, and then we'll be able to accomplish that. So it's a very, very powerful lesson, and it could be used in many different contexts, and I repeat it very often on my trips and in my speeches. I remember Rav Baruch Mordechai Ezrachi used it in his hesped of the Rosh Yeshiva, the Mir of Nosson Tzvi Finkel. He said, how was he able to accomplish so much? He said this story of Rav Isser Zalman, which is a classic. It's a famous story. And he said, he did it with all his fire of Rav Baruch Mordechai. Either way, getting back to Rav Isser Zalman. So when he comes of marriageable age, so he marries into the Frank family, the legendary Frank family, Reb Shaga Feivel Frank of Aleksut, a suburb of Kovno, who was very close with the Musar movement, a very close student of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, a very wealthy layman in Aleksut. And he plays a major, decisive role in the institutions that are being built in Kovno, in Slabodka at the time, the Kovno Koil, the Slabodka Yeshiva. Most of these institutions are loosely or closely affiliated with the Musar movement and the Musar personalities of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter, and later Rabbi Itzhak Petterberg and Mertali Amsterdam, the Alter Slabodka, and other Musar personalities are around the Kovno, Slabodka, Aleksut area during these years, and the Frank family is the center of it all. Their home was kind of like a headquarters of the Musar movement. And Reb Shaga Feivel Frank, the wealthy Reb Shaga Feivel Frank, passes away at a young age, and he asks his wife, that their daughters should all marry aspiring young Talmidei Chachamim, Torah scholars, and they each and every one of them do. So one of them marries Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer, Rebbe Beila Hinda, and the other ones, Menucha marries Reb Moshe Mordechai Epstein, and the other two girls, daughters of Reb Shraga Feivel Frank, marry Reb Sheftel Kramer, who eventually, he's the Mashgiach in Slutzk with his brother-in-law Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. Later on, he is a Rav in Russia, and then later on he moves to the United States, where he's a Rosh Yeshiva in New Haven, and his son-in-law, Reb Yaakov Yitzchak Ruderman, is eventually, of course, Ner Yisrael. And then the fourth son-in-law was Reb Baruch Horovitz, who was in Alaksut. He was the Rav in Alaksut. He's the only one who stayed in the neighborhood, and he eventually also became a Rosh Yeshiva in Slabodka during World War I and remained there until his passing in the 1930s. His kever we actually go to. Reb Baruch Horovitz, he's buried in Alaksut in the last remaining Jewish cemetery in Kovno. So we go to his kever. His son, Reb Shraga Feivel Horovitz, who's named, of course, for his grandfather, Reb Shraga Feivel Frank, was killed by the Nazis in the Kovno ghetto. And of course, Rabbi Zalman is buried in Har HaMenuchos in the Chelkas Harabanim in Har HaMenuchos, and Rabbi Moshe Mordechai Epstein is buried in Har HaZeisim. I believe Rabbi Sheftel Kramer is buried in the United States. So the four brothers-in-law are on the four corners of the world, but they both made very significant contributions to the Torah world. So it seems like they did well. Rebbetzin Beila Hinda becomes a legendary part of the story of Rav Isser Zalman as well, because she's something of a scholar, of a Torah scholar herself, quite brilliant and scholarly and knowledgeable and talkative. She had a tongue, and she expressed her opinion on quite a few occasions. So she was something of a noted figure herself. Now, Rav Isser Zalman, when he was in Volozhin, he was part of a clandestine organization in the yeshiva, among the students of the yeshiva, which many prestigious students of the yeshiva were affiliated with, called Nes Tziona, which was close to the Chovevei Tzion movement, which was a proto-Zionist movement before political Zionism. This was a Chovevei Tzion, the lovers of Zion. He and his future brother-in-law, Moshe Mordechai Epstein, were affiliated with that, as was the Frank family. And when they marry into the Frank family, they all together, the Franks and Rabbi Isser Zalman and Moshe Mordechai Epstein, they invest in some of the early Chovevei Tzion real estate settlements, in primarily Hadera, which Hadera today is a major city in Israel, was built by Kovno religious Jews, most of them affiliated with either Volozhin or the Musar movement. And Moshe Mordechai Epstein and Rabbi Isser Zalman were prominent among them. They invest in Hadera, and they're from the early builders of Hadera. Moshe Mordechai Epstein even lived there for a couple of years. Rabbi Isser Zalman did not make it, and so that's another part of their story as well. So while he's engaged, he actually studies in Radin by the Chofetz Chaim. He becomes a student of the Chofetz Chaim, and they're very close to them as well. And there are several stories of his relationship with the Chofetz Chaim as well. So he gets a little bit of everything. And shortly afterwards, when he's only 24 years old, he is hired to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Slabodka by the Alter of Slabodka, Nossi Finkel, together with his brother-in-law, Moshe Mordechai Epstein. They become these two young sons-in-law of Reb Shraga Feivel Frank, of the deceased Reb Shraga Feivel Frank, are now hired to become Rosh Yeshiva of Slabodka. So what's the story behind that? Because that's pretty much one of the major stories of his life. The Slabodka Yeshiva during its first decade struggled to define itself. The Alter was trying to create something unique in a Musar Yeshiva, which is really the first of its kind, as well as a classic Volozhin-style learning yeshiva. And he wanted to have that synthesis of both. And he hired Rashi Yeshiva, first Reb Chaim Rabinovich, who would later on be known as Reb Chaim Telzer, and later on Reb Avram Abba Burstein, and then later on Reb Itzel Panovizher, and they leave one at a time. The first two in 1890, Reb Itzel Panovizher in 1894, and it was primarily due to the educational differences in approach that they had with the Alter, with their not being adherents to the Musar movement and style. and opposed to his Musar approach, especially within the curriculum of the yeshiva. So the Alter decided, after they all left, to bring in younger blood, younger ones that he'd be able to control and maintain discipline, and they'd be brought in strictly on an employee basis, that they would be there to be rosh yeshiva, to attract a young following to deliver shiurim, but the education of the yeshiva would be solely the purview of the Alter. So, of course, the Frank family had a lot to say about the Slabodka yeshiva and its development as well, because they were the close supporters of the yeshiva, and they were there, right there in Al-Aqsut. So, though Rav Isser Zalman and Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein had studied in Volozhin, which was not affiliated with the Musar movement, but since they were now married into the Frank family, they absorbed a bit of the Musar environment during their years of kest, of support, in that home, which was a Musar hub, as I described. So the Alter felt comfortable hiring them. He felt that there would not be opposition from them to his style of Musar, but nevertheless, just to be sure, and this I don't think is well known, he sends the two of them to Kelm for some hishtalmut, for some Musar training, as it were, in the great citadel of Musar in Kelm. Before he hired them, so they go for this short stint in Kelm, the two of them. Now, to be ready to be hired by the Alter in Slabodka. Now, Rav Moshe Mordechai Epstein was considered closer to the Musar movement and more submissive in a way to the Alter, whereas Rav Isser Zalman was considered a bit more distant from Musar, and he had less of a close relationship with the Alter. In addition, Rav Moshe Mordechai had a stronger personality, while Rav Isser Zalman was a bit of a softer personality. Now, these differences between the two brothers-in-law would have great ramifications as to their respective career paths in the future. So now they're rosh yeshiva in Slabodka, and there was actually a whole story about Rabbi Alter almost hired Reb Aaron Bakst, Reb Archik Bakst, as the rosh yeshiva in Slabodka, but he had been engaged to one of the daughters of the Frank family, and the engagement did not materialize. It didn't work out because they didn't foresee a great future for Reb Archik Bakst, which was unfortunate, because Reb Archik Bakst had an incredible future. He was a great Rav in several different towns, including Tsaritin, which later was Stalingrad. He was the rabbi there, but he was the rabbi in Lomzhen, Shavel, and 4 or 5 other towns, and he was a great Musar, student of Kelm, but the Frank family and Reb Archik Bakst didn't have a good ending, that relationship, and therefore it wouldn't have been appropriate to hire Reb Archik Bakst to be the rosh yeshiva in Slabodka, which would be in the face of the Frank family, who were the close supporters. It would be a little bit awkward. So instead, he wasn't hired, and instead they hired the sons-in-law of the Frank family. So a bit of nepotism there. But in any event, so he becomes the rosh yeshiva in Slabodka. He starts delivering shiurim, and he's this young, brilliant lamdan. He's 24 years old when he's appointed rosh yeshiva, and he attracts the cream of Slabodka, the biggest lamdanim, the iluyim, and he gets this, attracts quite a following. And by nature, it was primarily the non-Musar faction in the Slabodka yeshiva. So it immediately starts to create a bit of a tension, and this comes to a head several years later. And that leads to the 1897 split in Slabodka, which leads to the... there's 2 things really which happens. There's the move to Slutzk. Rav Isser Zalman leaves with the Yad HaChazaka, 14 young, brilliant students of Slabodka, to start a branch sort of Slabodka in Slutzk, and he becomes the rosh yeshiva there, and that's on the invitation of the Ridbaz, Rabbi Yaakov David Volovsky, and that starts a branch there in Slutzk. And eventually, when the Ridvaz leaves for Chicago, and then later for Tzfas, so the Rav Isser Zalman succeeds him as the rabbi of Slutzk. So he becomes the rabbi of the town and the rosh yeshiva of the yeshiva there. And that eventually also in Slabodka itself there is a Musar split, the pro and anti-Musar factions, and the Alter leaves and starts Knesset Yisrael, and it is related to this story of Rav Isser Zalman and leaving to Slutzk. And it becomes a bit complicated as well. So the whole thing mixes together, and it comes to head in 1897. That's the crucial year. So that we'll cover in the part 2 of Rav Isser Zalman, which will be released in a few days. So we'll get the whole story of the Slutzk event, and then his later life in Slutzk, and then in Yerushalayim, and his later years of leadership. So this was part 1 about Rav Isser Zalman Meltzer. Stay tuned shortly for part 2. This is Yehuda Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. Don't forget to register and sign up for what's to be a very exciting Kvarim tour in the Mount Judah Cemetery this coming Friday, July 29th at 9:30 a.m. You can register at my website, yehudageberer.com. Looking forward to seeing all of you. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform, and I hope you enjoyed.